Okay. So, in terms of the stimulus material, two articles that I found really inspirational were Richard Nixon's address to the nation on Labor Day and the image of Rosie the Riveter. Especially Nixon's address, I took this quote: "It is not surprising that so many hardworking Americans are wondering what's happening to the work ethic in America today." I thought this quote was really important because this was a question that was relevant in 1971. However, it can still be applied today as it is being asked by older generations of millennials. I also took the image of Rosie the Riveter because I thought that Rosie the Riveter was a symbol of females defying stereotypes during World War II. And since I was researching on millennials defying stereotypes in the workplace, I thought it was a good comparison. So with that in mind, my research question is the perceived difference in work ethic between millennials and older generations in the United States accurate? So first, to understand my question, there are some limitations. It was hard to come up with a working definition for work ethic, since work ethic is not a statistic. It is not something that can be mathematically measured. So how can you how can you decide to value one person's opinion over what work ethic is over another's? So that was a big limitation for me. Another thing is that my focus was just primarily millennials in the corporate environment, as to compared, for example, like millennials working on a farm or something, because it was research data and interviews were a lot more widely available. And eventually, the focus of my paper and this presentation eventually shifted from just work ethic to whether, in spite of these perceived differences, whether millennials can actually still be beneficial in the workplace. So my first perspective that I researched on was that millennials are spoiled and entitled, and that there's a large difference in work ethic between them and older generations. So first, this stereotype that millennials are spoiled and entitled. I have the example of Talia Jane here, and Talia Jane was a customer agent for Yelp, and she published a highly criticized online letter to Yelp CEO, complaining that Yelp was not paying her enough. However, she was criticized by many media outlets as she did not take steps to reduce her own living costs, such as finding a roommate or choosing to live closer to her workplace. She was described as melodramatic and indigent, and she was eventually fired. I also researched on Johnny Oleksinski. He wrote an article in the New York Post, and Johnny Oleksinski is actually a millennial himself, but this article was written by him slamming millennials as well. And he cited the example of Hastings High School's senior award ceremony, in which they handed out 87 commendations to a class of 141 students. And I think this is just an example of millennials further reinforcing the participation award idea, in which people don't really have to work as hard in order to get rewards, and because of this they end up being spoiled and entitled and believing that they can just get rewards for not working as hard. A quote I thought was interesting from his article was that he said, the millennials' messiah complex is a result of being coddled, petted, and worshipped like toy poodles from infancy all the way to college. Another stereotype that I focused on was the perceived difference in work ethic. Joel Pavelski, he is a writer in Mike, a news website that caters to millennials, and basically he reached national headlines for lying to his boss about taking time off for a family member's funeral. Instead, he used this time off to go and build a treehouse in Wisconsin. He was described by the New York Times as a prevaricating treehouse builder, but when he returned to Mike, he was not fired. So the second perspective I researched was that millennials are actually essential to the future of the American workforce, and that there's a negligible difference in work ethic, so completely different from my first perspective. So first, I just want to start with some quotes. Laura Olin, a social media strategist for Barack Obama during his 2012 re-election campaign, stated that millennials are wise enough to realize that no one is going to fix the world for them, and that it's up to them. Lisa Walden, a generational expert, she researches ways to help companies better work with varying age groups, such as Gen Xers, baby boomers, millennials. And she said the millennials are a generation that have grown up with a lot of technology. They're very tech savvy. So for this perspective, I mainly focused on, again, the stereotypes that the work ethic is different. However, I focused on the reasoning that the work ethic is different because millennials have different career goals. And I also did some research on the stereotype that millennials want constant acclaim. The primary source I used for this was the IBM study titled Myths, Exaggerations, and Uncomfortable Truths, the Real Story Behind Millennials in the Workplace. This was a study based on 1,784 employees from companies across 12 countries and 6 industries, as well as all 3 of the previous generations I mentioned earlier, baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials. So firstly, I took figure one, and figure one, the question in figure one was select the 2 long-term career goals that are most important to you. So there is a common stereotype that the work ethic of millennials and older generations is different because they have different career goals. However, if you look at this table, you can see that as it moves down, there are different career goals. But if you compare the numbers are actually pretty similar, showing that all 3 generations actually they place the same weight on many of the same career goals, which means that this stereotype could be said to be largely inaccurate. Another stereotype that I researched was that millennials want constant acclaim on participation awards. Figure 4 touched on this, and the question was, if a team is successful, should everyone be rewarded? However, the conclusion from this, as you can tell by this bar graph, was that it was actually Generation X who felt that everyone should be rewarded in a team if a team was successful, showing that it is not just millennials who want constant acclaim and participation awards. So what are some conclusions we can draw from this IBM study? Millennials actually have pretty much the same career goals as Gen X and baby boomers. So this refutes my first stereotype. And millennials actually just want fair treatment and not special treatment. An excerpt I took from the conclusion of this study: millennials represent the first wave of digital natives to enter the workforce, and this does distinguish them. Organizations that have embarked on their own transformation urgently need this digital capital. They should eagerly look for ways to embrace millennials and create the work environments where top talent can flourish across all generations. So on that note, what can millennials actually bring to the table? According to a 2015 survey on millennials conducted by Elansodesk, almost 70% of managers said that their millennial employees were equipped with skills that people from previous generations were not. So one technique I specifically researched on was reverse mentoring. Reverse mentoring is a process by which millennials take on older employees as apprentices and help them develop skills in technology and social media. And this technique has been so successful that it has already been implemented in big companies such as Target, United Health, and Google. So my conclusion, it was hard to come up with a non-generalized conclusion. As I said, there could be a difference in work ethic as shown by my case studies, but these could also be exaggerated due to the social media exposure. For example, stories could be sensationalized in various news outlets, whereas 30 or 40 years ago, if something similar happened, not a lot of people would know about it. And I concluded that although there might be a difference in work ethic, even if there was, the difference is very negligible, and that the stereotype that there is a difference in work ethic is largely inaccurate. I believe that millennials are essential to the future of the workforce, and that their unique talent should be put to use in ways and environments where they can excel. And again, these results are highly generalized. It is unfair to say that all millennials have a good work ethic, but then again, it is also unfair to say that all millennials have a bad work ethic. So yeah, thank you.
In your research, you have some sources that are kind of unusual given things that we typically look at.
Yeah.
So how did you go about assessing the reliability and the credibility of the sources that you use?
Well, first I looked at who was writing it, and I felt that it was really interesting to take writers. For example, Johnny Oleksinski. I thought that his source was the fact that I use him as a source is really interesting. Since he is a millennial himself, it would be a lot more. His view of millennials would be a lot more accurate, I feel, than anyone else's. Seeing that he is a millennial and he's grown up alongside millennials, I just felt that his opinion and his arguments were a lot stronger than everyone else's.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you could extend your research and kind of what would be like the next area that you would look at?
I guess maybe expanding on my slide about reverse mentoring, finding potential other ways that millennials could be used in the workplace, because as I mentioned earlier, millennials bring such a unique technological instinct and a knack for social media that the previous generations don't possess, or they're not as strong in that area. So I feel like exploring how they could be used to just improve a company in terms of this technology and social media way would be really interesting.